energy efficiency, and electric vehicles, basically everything you need, soup to nuts, to try to decarbonize the economy and scale up clean energy. So that's kind of the context for my portfolio. And then right now, some of you may have come across Mark Shebist, who was an amazing NRDC staffer for the past, I guess, 7 or 8 years. He was the lead for our Pennsylvania work on climate clean energy. He's since moved on to take a really exciting job in Maryland with the Office of People's Counsel. They're working on similar issues. And so since his departure, in addition to my regional role, I am kind of like the Pennsylvania lead for NRDC on climate and clean energy issues. Before I dive into the slide deck, for additional context, Jackie Annis is the analyst on our team who conducted all this modeling. She couldn't be here tonight, but just want to give all the credit to her for the analytics that went into this slide presentation. With that, we can dive in. I mean, I think just big picture context, I think as most folks are probably aware on the call, it's a really exciting time right now in Pennsylvania with a new administration, with Governor Shapiro coming in, and with the in the legislature, we've got the House with a narrow, albeit Democratic majority for now, that is going to alter, I think, the landscape to some extent in Harrisburg in terms of what is possible legislatively, and also kind of where things may be headed on the regulatory side with some of these policies that I'm going to talk about today. But with that, Phyllis, anything else you want from me in terms of high level before we dive in? Okay, great. So here's a lovely slide with some nice wind facilities on the screen. Essentially, what we're going to talk about today is that there's 2 very important policies that are kind of in play right now in Pennsylvania. One is a policy that's been in place for some time now. It's called the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard, which was adopted almost 15 years ago, maybe 17 years ago, that basically established at the time, pivotal renewables policy for Pennsylvania to drive additional renewables in not only Pennsylvania, but also across the region. Pennsylvania is part of what's known as PJM. It's it's the largest actual grid in the world in terms of how many megawatts and how many power plants are part of it. It goes all the way from North Carolina all the way over to Illinois. And so as a result of the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard that was adopted in statute under the Rendell administration, there's been some significant progress on renewables, but that policy is essentially kind of flatlined as of 2020. So it required a certain percentage of the energy that you consume by your distribution utilities to be supplied by renewable energy. And without kind of additional action by the legislature to kind of revive that Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard, we're not really going to see more growth. And so there's going to be some legislation moving this session in Harrisburg to try to kind of scale that up, extend it out to 2030, scale up the level of renewables requirements to 30% by 2030. And that's a policy that Governor Shapiro expressed interest in supporting during his campaign, and he's continuing to be interested in doing that during this legislative session. The other policy that's kind of a cornerstone for any progress by Pennsylvania to cut emissions from the power sector is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And so that's a policy that was initiated back in 2008. It includes states all the way from Maine down to Virginia. And it basically requires that any power plant in those states has to purchase 1 allowance for every 1 ton of carbon that they emit from their power plants. And essentially Pennsylvania, we'll dive in right here for the next slide. So RGGI basically is already on the books through a regulatory process, not through legislation. It's currently being challenged in court by fossil fuel interests and some Republican members of the Senate and House. But right now, as it stands, assuming that that regulation withstands legal challenge in the Supreme Court upon appeal, that would be basically a requirement in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is such a large emitter of emissions from the power sector due to how many gas plants we have, and there's a few coal plants left as well. It really is kind of a pivotal policy that would reduce emissions over time from the power sector. And so this analysis was basically initiated to kind of ask the question of, okay, if the politics necessitate kind of a question of, do we want to pursue an alternative energy portfolio standard extension and enhancement, or should we go with a regional greenhouse gas initiative, implementation? Which one would drive emissions reductions from the power sector in Pennsylvania? And so we initiated this modeling to basically answer that question and really highlight how these are two very important policies, but they are very different in terms of what outcomes they drive in the state. And so here, and on this slide here, you can see right here. So basically, the RGGI regulation is already on the books. It's going through legal challenge right now. Assuming that it's upheld at the Supreme Court, once we get to that phase of the litigation, RGGI would be the law of the land. And again, to just reiterate, every fossil power plant in Pennsylvania would be required to purchase a RGGI allowance to cover each ton of carbon dioxide that they emit at their power plant. And that cap declines over time by 3% per year. And so it kind of guarantees a reduction over time in the emissions from power plants in Pennsylvania. It's a carbon dioxide reduction program, but when you get those reductions from carbon dioxide, you also get extensive benefits in terms of co-pollutant reductions, and that results in major health benefits. The AEPS guarantees you a certain level of renewables penetration. And so it guarantees you more solar, more wind, but it does not necessarily guarantee that emissions from the fossil power plants go down over time. And that's what this analysis was meant to kind of dig into and then see what would be the result of either doing one or the other or both. So in the next slide here, what we did, we conducted a what's known as IPM is the model. That's the tool that we utilized. NRDC works with a firm known as ICF that essentially is kind of like the gold standard for when you're trying to do modeling and analysis in the power sector, and you want to look at what policy like levers would drive certain outcomes. It's the same model that the US EPA uses. It's the same model that the Pennsylvania DEP utilized when doing its own analysis to see what RGGI would result in for Pennsylvania. And so it's kind of the gold standard is basically, if you're using IPM and you're having ICF do the modeling, it's kind of in expert analytical circles that kind of guarantees you're getting kind of like very credible outcomes for your modeling. I would caveat that all modeling is imperfect. So this is not perfect foresight, but it is certainly, I think, probably the gold standard for looking at what would happen in the future under various policy scenarios. So what we looked at is we looked at a reference case in that first scenario. That's your baseline about what would happen with neither RGGI on the books or a enhanced alternative energy portfolio standard by 2030. We then did a run to look at what the power sector looks like if you only did the RGGI policy without the AEPS. We then did only AEPS without RGGI. And then the third scenario that we ran in the model was if you had both RGGI and the AEPS. Next slide, please, Phyllis. And so essentially, just kind of the top line results that we'll show you right now in some figures is that if you don't have RGGI in place, and this is kind of a counterintuitive result, so I want to unpack it and we can talk more about it in the Q&A. If you don't have RGGI on the books in Pennsylvania, you really have no guarantees that we're going to see reductions from the power sector in Pennsylvania. And that's because Pennsylvania is not an island. It is part of that really large PJM power grid, which is 13 states. And so what happens is if you don't have a mandatory binding reduction requirement on power plants in Pennsylvania, you can build endless megawatts of solar and wind, including in Pennsylvania, and you'll have more renewable energy, and there's benefits to that. But you will still have the huge fleet of gas plants in Pennsylvania running more and more and more and exporting that power throughout the grid. And that's just the kind of the reality of it. And but at the same time, the current AEPS is not ambitious enough to really drive more renewables growth. And so they're basically, the way to think about it is they're two critically important tools, but they deliver completely different outcomes. So just driving greater renewables growth is important, but it's not a one-to-one scenario where every solar panel and wind farm you put online backs out an equivalent amount of fossil plants. That doesn't happen. And so that's why RGGI comes in as being so critical to ensure you get the reductions from the power sector. Both of them work together, though, hand in hand is kind of the takeaway. We really need both of these policies to drive Pennsylvania in the direction we need to in the power sector. Next slide, please, Willis. And so you can see here, basically, if you take a look at the line graph, when you look right here on the lower line with Pennsylvania in RGGI, you can see the dramatic reduction in how many tons of carbon dioxide are emitted from the power sector in Pennsylvania. If you look with just the AEPS, but not being part of RGGI, you're going to get more renewables, but you are not going to meaningfully reduce carbon reductions from the power sector in Pennsylvania. And also, just to back up a second, Pennsylvania is the third largest emitter of carbon dioxide from the power sector in the entire country. So the stakes for Pennsylvania in targeting the power sector really can't be overstated. If you look at states like Massachusetts or even in New York or some other states that have gone further faster in terms of renewables, the fossil emissions from the power sector in Pennsylvania are massive. They literally dwarf the entire RGGI region collectively. The emissions from Pennsylvania alone are almost bigger than the entire 12-state region that's in RGGI. And so that's why you're seeing this huge delta between having Pennsylvania in RGGI versus not in RGGI, and you're seeing those lines above up top. And again, all these slides will be available from Phyllis afterwards, so you can take a look after the fact. Phyllis, next slide, please. And so here we go. This is basically just highlighting the fact again that I said that Pennsylvania is not really an island. It is exporting. It's actually the #1 largest net exporter of electricity in the nation. And so a huge amount of the power that we're generating in Pennsylvania is being generated to serve demand in other states. And that's why we're seeing that outcome that if you don't have RGGI in place, you're not going to see reductions. Now, some opponents of RGGI claim that, well, if you reduce emissions in Pennsylvania, are you just shifting those emissions to West Virginia or Ohio, for example? And the answer is no. You're going to see some gas plants in neighboring states that aren't in RGGI potentially run a little bit more, but you're still seeing, if you look at these regional reductions, you're still seeing net reductions over time from the entire PJM region with Pennsylvania in RGGI. And so it's not a case that, that it's futile to reduce emissions from the power plants in Pennsylvania because it'll just be generated elsewhere. You see net reductions over time across the region because Pennsylvania is such a huge player in the market. Next slide, Phyllis. And so on the AEPS side, going back to the renewables build-outs, you can see right here that basically with a expanded 30 by 30 is what's known as 30% requirement to procure basically 30% of our supply from renewable sources by 2030, you are going to see significant increases in the build-out of solar and wind in Pennsylvania, as well as across the PJM region. There is a 10% in-state solar carve-out that is required that we assume for purposes of the modeling that was adopted a couple of years ago. We're assuming that would go forward through 2030. And so you can see you have significant build-out of renewables, which again, very important, but is not a substitute for a binding reduction requirement on emissions. Because as I said, going back, we're such a huge net exporter, you can plow tons of money into renewable energy, even in-state renewable energy. And if you don't have a requirement to reduce emissions from those fossil plants, you're still going to see emissions go through the roof through 2030, even with all these renewables. Next slide, please. And so I'll just like gloss over this slide. Folks can take a look at it later. This like basically just summarizes some of the assumptions that went into the modeling. It is built in, utilizing all of the latest data about the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law in terms of costs of renewables, et cetera. So this is basically just in case if you really want to dig in technically to some of the assumptions, this would be that slide, but we can go to the next slide, Phyllis. Ditto for this one. We can go ahead and skip this slide. Folks can refer back to it later, but it's just kind of outlining how that works in terms of what we assumed in the modeling to reflect what was the business as usual. So I'll stop there. I know that was kind of a lot and I was going quickly, and I actually can stay on till 7:40, Phyllis, if that's helpful, because I just got a text and my kids are going to be tied up later than I thought. So
great.
We have about 20 minutes for Q&A to the extent if folks have questions we want to dig into.
Thank you. So any questions that people have? It was a lot of material, but you presented it so well. And
right, I know that was a lot. I apologize for.
Oh, the graphics were really clear too. Thank you. What does BAU stand for?
Business as usual. And so basically in this case, BAU, which is basically when you do these like analyses, what you do is you kind of, the baseline run is kind of like if you didn't have RGGI or an expanded AEPS. And for purposes of this analysis, it's important that the BAU includes the Inflation Reduction Act and all the most up-to-date data on like the cost of wind and solar based on the new tax credits, the most up-to-date projections on demand for electricity, and all of that kind of thing. So all of that goes into the BAU. And then what you do is you layer on each scenario with just RGGI and then just AEPS and then both. So the BAU is kind of your baseline, is how to think of it. Because then you can see the impacts of what changes.
So we're a small enough group. If you have a question, Eric has a question. I was going to say, just raise your hand. So Eric is going to lead us off with his question.
So just that point about the IRA and other federal laws. So it seemed like all three of your models, right, or four, just assume the same things about say implementing, spending the money from the IRA and other federal things. So that, do you have anything to say about like how things would be different if those were not implemented? Like, because I know some states like Ohio and West Virginia are slow walking, using that money. And I think Josh tends to be pretty aggressive, wants to be pretty aggressive with that, but I just wanted to know how that affected your models.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so it's a great point. And you're absolutely right. The governor has assembled an amazing team. I was actually just on a call just 2 days ago with some folks from our federal team in DC that have worked on the IRA a lot, and some really brilliant folks in Shapiro's team that are working specifically on how to utilize and maximize the financing opportunities from the IRA. So it's a great point. I feel pretty good about that side of things, about the staff that are in place in the governor's office and at DEP, chasing every single grant they can find and every dollar they can get to plug wells, et cetera. For purposes of this analysis exercise, it really is about the utility scale sector of power. And so there's a ton of much more complex IRA modeling you can do, but really what the IRA is modeling when you build it into the base case here is really just the significant reduction in the cost per megawatt of building a utility scale solar project or a utility scale wind project. And luckily that doesn't even really require any proactive action by a state. It's literally going to be a developer being like, I see a good wind resource in this region of this state. I thought about it before. Now it really pencils out. Now I can get financing at a bank because you bought it down by 30% because it's a tax credit. And so, which is one of the beauties of the IRA. Like, there's other parts of the IRA where you do have to have proactive work by a state agency to deploy tax credits for a heat pump in a building or ensure a disadvantaged community gets, certain incentives directly. For this analysis, we're looking at like the big power sector stuff. And that actually kind of, frankly, goes around any role for a state. You can have a state stifle development of renewables by like adopting laws that prevent them from being built. So that's another layer. But in Pennsylvania, I think one of the takeaways, though, that you see in that AEPS expansion is that you are going to see states that have aggressive renewables policies in place. It's just that much of a sweeter incentive. Okay. So basically, if I'm like looking at if I'm about to build a wind farm in Southwest Pennsylvania or in Ohio, and Pennsylvania has a more aggressive AEPS by 2030, it's going to be that much more lucrative or cheaper for me to build it there. All else equal, right? Assuming you have the wind resource and it's equal. And so there's very much a role for states that adopt aggressive renewables policies to attract that investment. But there's luckily not, for better or for worse, like if you're not stopping a project from being built in Ohio and a wind developer finds a good place to build it, the federal tax incentive, they're going to get that no matter what Ohio does, if that makes sense.
So we have lots more questions. Fred has 2 questions. April has a question. Julia has a question. Rachel has a question. So let's start with Fred. He's been patiently waiting.
Yeah, I was just wondering, it seems like wind and solar are both so important as renewable energies, but there has been very few wind farms built in the Pennsylvania in the last number of years, and there's a lot of solar projects that are sort of backed up on the PJM queue, and maybe that's just a thing that FERC needs to work out. I don't know if there's anything we can help to do with that. But back on the wind power, I'm just wondering, is there a reason that or something that can be done to get wind power rolling again in Pennsylvania?
It's a great question. I don't have like any specific insights on what has kind of presented a specific barrier beyond just kind of the broader local NIMBY stuff that pops up occasionally. Not that that's not a challenge for solar projects as well, but typically, I know there's been some issues on various projects that I've seen proposed on certain ridges where there's opposition from a township or zoning stuff. And again, solar's facing those things too, but just by the nature of the density of a solar project, like per acre versus a wind project, I think that's been part of it. I do think if you saw an AEPS expansion to 30 by 30, you're not going to guarantee in-state wind development unless you built in an in-state requirement the way we have for 10% in-state for solar right now in Pennsylvania. The bigger picture stuff is a whole other conversation. It's what keeps me up at night. PJM has 4% renewables. It's embarrassing. And the interconnection queue is a disgusting logjam of projects. NRDC is working aggressively. It's one of probably our top 3 priorities that we work on as an institution at the FERC level and at PJM to try to break that logjam and accelerate the interconnection queue, because there's thousands and thousands and thousands of megawatts of renewables that are waiting in line basically to interconnect. So
FERC is working to improve that situation, but I mean, if there's something legislatively or that advocates for renewable energy could do, and I'd love to hear about it, but it is a very big backlog these days. So yeah.
April?
Thank you so much. I stepped in a little bit late, so I'm sorry if this was maybe covered. I was wondering if any of the new laws or policies do or would take away any incentives from the fossil fuels, like the kinds of tax credits and things that they get.
Unfortunately not. And it's a great point. I mean, I think that's like the frustrating thing about this advocacy space generally is that the rhetoric from the fossil industry is always like, oh, those technologies can't stand on their own, blah, blah, blah. And yet, you look at the trillions of dollars that have gone to fossil for 100 years. And so there's not any policies that would kind of reduce those. And there's a lot of them federally, but there's also an extra a lot of them in Pennsylvania, as many of you are probably aware, which is frustrating. But again, with the incentives of the IRA federally are so aggressive, like it really is a game-changing situation federally. And I think that's why you when you're going to see states that leverage that opportunity to layer on an additional state incentive to attract investment, that's going to hopefully get us kind of over the line on what right now is skewed the other direction. So yeah, but there's not like an explicit, like, let's not continue to give like silly tax credits to, you know, gas drilling and natural gas consumption, which we have a lot of in Pennsylvania, as you're probably aware. So yeah, apologies. I wish I had a better answer than that.
Awesome. No, that was great.
Your question is similar to your remarks are similar to what Rachel said. Rachel, can you unmute, or do you want me to read your question?
Hi. Yes, I have heard Senator Yaw, which on numerous times I listened to a lot of his hearings, and he really does not like renewable energy, as we know. And so, but what he says about RGGI, how can we refute what he says? I think he's just lying about it. And so does NRDC ever meet with him? And how can we need to provide him with some of the facts, I think.
Yes, and so Rachel, I feel your pain. I am sadly a Senator Yaw constituent, not proudly. I'm painfully aware of his delusional positions on climate change and renewable energy. We continue to refute a lot of his falsehoods that he advances at every turn. Frankly, he doesn't want to hear it. I mean, he basically, you know, he owns a great deal of gas assets himself. Like he's transparently like involved in the fossil industry. It's not even like speculative. Like he owns gas assets. So we're not ever going to change his mind. And so it's really more about refuting his misinformation that we see in the media. And so we constantly kind of have to like respond to his op-eds that advance, you know, falsehoods about RGGI and about renewables and about reliability. I mean, going back to the reliability question, that's his favorite boogeyman. Like, oh, we need this like great gas thing to like save us all, or we're all gonna die. We almost had rolling blackouts across PJM, and it was all because of gas plants failing. Like wind overperformed. Like wind was killing it. Like the forecast, like the day ahead forecast for wind in PJM, it was like maxing out beyond like what they predicted, and the gas plants were all failing. But you know, Senator Yaw was even kind of silly enough to have a recent hearing where he brought PJM in, and PJM presented those irrefutable facts, which are real and which are result in massive fines for those gas facilities for failing to deliver power, which they had been paid to deliver in the capacity markets in PJM. And so it's frustrating. We're never going to change his mind, and it's about, I think, changing the mind of those that we can. And so I think there's going to be factions in the legislature that are immovable. There's factions in the legislature that are, I think, supportive of climate progress and renewables and the transition. And then there are members in the middle. And I think those are the folks we try to focus on, is shoring up the support we have and refuting the misinformation that folks like Senator Yaw advance, and with analysis like we just showed. And it's exhausting, but like that's what we do. So that's the best answer I give you. And we literally have, you know, myth versus fact sheets that we put together all the time on RGGI. You know, I can share those with Phyllis too. There's a really great coalition. Some of you guys may be part of the listserv, but it's called the Clean Power PA Coalition that NRDC is part of, and Phyllis is on that. That's where this original presentation was presented. And we are constantly updating the website with kind of, you know, myth busting, you know, fact rebuttals to stuff that folks like Senator Yaw like to advance. And so that's kind of all we can do. But we're never going to change his mind. At least I don't think we will. And so it's, you know, he's entrenched He's making a lot of money off fossil fuels, and that's who he works for, not the people, in my mind.
So Cynthia
you.
has a question.
Yeah, and you mentioned how backlogged PJM is, the need for permit reform. I was just wondering how much that might affect the success of your modeled outcomes, or if that's kind of built in already.
Right, great question. And so there are limits on how much we can, like, you can't build in kind of headwinds for siting for, like, not even just PJM, but like in the model, you can't build in like, we're gonna like reduce the amount of deployment by 10% based on like NIMBY activities by various communities, like to oppose renewables projects. There are limits, so we can't build that in for purposes of like these runs, right? And so it's just kind of like beyond the capacity of the model to kind of layer in like a variable and plug in like a lever that says like PJM like needs to fix their interconnection queue. It does assume it's basically an optimization model. And so it's basically looking at the system, it's looking at like what policies you have in place, and it's projecting how much electricity demand there's going to be, and then building it out in the least cost way. And so it is imperfect, and it's not able to capture. So on that front, you could argue that it's somewhat optimistic if you were to not correct the PJM interconnection queue logjam. But I also feel like that has become such a hot issue with FERC and with PJM, and PJM admits it's a problem. Let's put it this way: if we don't fix that, we're screwed. and you can't put that into the model, but like, I think that, and it's not going to get fixed overnight, but it's that big of a deal. But I think there's a lot of really smart people. I think PJM actively is working to try to fix it. I think they took too long to get there, but I think they know now they've got to. Like, there's not even any there's almost no fossil projects in the queue in PJM. It's almost all renewables. So it's so frustrating because you see that and you're like, oh, like we're about to get there. Like, let's go. And like, you gotta, in addition to the interconnection queue itself, are the transmission challenges, right? So siting of transmission and siting of renewable energy, coupled with that interconnection piece, is what we're going to live or die by if we're going to get where we need to go. And so it's not built in explicitly into the model because there's no way to kind of build it into IPM. It's very much a cost optimization model. It's like with the IRA and with these policies, solar and wind compete at this level, gas is at this level. So we see this build out, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yep.
So before we get back to Fred, Julia is an activist. I know a lot of the work that she does, and she's constantly talking to people, writing about RGGI, and she wants to make sure she can cite your sources. So I wonder if you could tell us or send us material. We did send out the blog that you send me, but is this analysis available on your website yet? On NRDC's website, not your personal website.
Sure, yeah. So basically, like I would say you should feel free to cite the blog itself. The blog itself links to the slide deck that I went through. And those last couple of slides have links to the appendices, the assumptions, the fact that IPM modeling is the tool we use, that ICF is who we commissioned to do the modeling. And so it's not a peer-reviewed study, but anybody who works in this space that looks at that is going to nod and be like, that's completely legit. Mm-hmm. And so it's not a peer-reviewed PhD type of work product, but it's anybody that refutes, even folks that disagree with us on what policies we want to advance, would agree that this is a legitimate analysis and that it's the gold standard. So that blog post is the best way to cite that.
So Fred has another question.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to make a comment that this is why I think the AEPS is so very, very important, because you have these fierce headwinds to get renewable energy projects built, like, for instance, this huge backlog on the PJM grid. So the AEPS is another pressure point that's going to I think, get this stuff moving, and, you have NIMBYism, you have various headwinds you don't always realize. You ask yourself, we have the IRA, we have wind and solar at historically low prices. Why isn't it happening? Well, there's reasons like this that it isn't happening, various headwinds.
So we're
Absolutely. Totally agree.
almost out of time, and I'm an action-oriented person. So Jackson, before you sign off, could you give us one action that we could all be doing to try to advance this both sides, what I say, two sides of the same coin?
Sure. So, I mean, I think as folks may be aware on the call or not, the RGGI process has been contentious under Governor Wolf to get the regulation adopted, not just from the fossil fuel industry and Senate Republicans in terms of litigation, but the labor community, unfortunately, has kind of almost, RGGI's kind of become almost like a boogeyman. It's stopped being about the substance of what the policy does or could do, and it's kind of become like the avatar of, like, if I'm a person who works in the gas industry or at the three remaining coal plants in Pennsylvania, RGGI's the enemy, and I'm going to do anything I can do to oppose it. I'm going to speak up in the media. I'm going to contribute lots of money to the governor's race and to legislators. And it's really, it's been unfortunate that it's kind of become such a toxic issue between labor and the environmental community. And there's a lot more history on the labor and environmental community in Pennsylvania that even predates my engagement here, which is, I've been working in Pennsylvania for 10 years now. But even when I got here 10 years ago, I was like, wow, like in all the other states I work in, I've never seen like a more contentious relationship between the labor community and in the environmental community, which is unfortunate. And I think in terms of action for you folks, I mean, I think staying engaged, Phyllis is part of the coalition, LTEs, a drumbeat about positive benefits that RGGI and the AEPS can deliver, not just for the environment and air quality and climate change, but for jobs and a transition to a sustainable clean energy future. All of those things are really critical because the opposition is going to continue that drumbeat to try to stop progress. I know that's not, rocket science that I'm throwing out because all of you folks are engaged, but I am like, I'm a, crazy optimist, even in the face of a lot of challenges. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to do my job every day because it's pretty daunting. But I am cautiously optimistic that Governor Shapiro, does he wish RGGI would go away? And is it a massive political headache for him? Absolutely. And I don't blame him. The only constituency that gave more money to his campaign than the environmental community was labor. He's not a cynical transactional guy, but I think he honestly believes, he's a politician, so that's part of it, just the resources. But I think he honestly believes genuinely in labor and in the environment, and he is in a really hard place right now. And I think you're going to see in the next week or two him follow through on his commitment to establish a RGGI working group that's going to try to have a rational discussion about a path forward outside of the rhetoric of like the press releases and like the Senator Yaw circus hearings and all that crap. And it's going to be a difficult process. I don't think it's going to be guaranteed that he's going to do AEPS or RGGI or what he's going to do. But I think he's genuinely committed to trying to get folks from those different factions to talk to each other and come back to him with hopefully some sort of consensus or compromise around a path forward that addresses the equally critical priorities of addressing climate change, scaling up renewable energy in the state of Pennsylvania, and figuring out a way to make that transition in a way that isn't what the catastrophic yaws of the world want to make it sound like. That there's going to be rolling blackouts, the economy's going to collapse, it's all going to be terrible, because that's what folks that don't want to see change want to advance that narrative. And so, coupled with the House being in, albeit razor thin control of the Democrats, that really does change the dynamic too on the legislative side. Under Wolf, all the legislative activity was all, how do we get 17 votes in the Senate to sustain a veto of like bad stuff that gets to the governor's desk, right? Like that was victory. And now we've got a scenario where the Senate's going to continue to send legislation over to the House that is roadblocks to clean energy progress. It's not a guarantee that the House won't move things like that forward, but it's certainly a different dynamic than it was before the last election. And I really think in terms of the RGGI discussion, there's going to be the Commonwealth Court decision, which comes down soon. We expect that to go against the state because the Commonwealth Court's terrible in Pennsylvania. The governor would appeal that to the Supreme Court. And then we think we have a pretty solid shot at the Supreme Court level due to the makeup of the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania. But in the meantime, there's going to be that RGGI working group announced by the governor that is going to come back to him with recommendations on what would hopefully be a path forward. And so that's just something to keep an eye on. There's not necessarily a direct action item for the working group. It's more, I think, the more drumbeat outside in both the media, in the LTEs, engaging with your elected officials, letters to the governor. I think that drumbeat can't be underestimated in terms of the value it provides, because the opposition is beating the hell out of that drum. And so I think don't underestimate like just getting LTEs, even like a small outlet like it's your local paper, like it all adds up. Like it needs to be like, okay, wow, I saw that thing here, and then somebody mentions it there, and then if someone passes it on to this person, like that drumbeat is really, really important. And I think, groups like yours have a vital role to play in that. And I don't think it should be underestimated. And so that was a rambling, long-winded answer, Phyllis, but I think it's, that's my perspective on kind of like the role in the near term for your group to kind of keep engaged. And then also the Clean Power PA website. If you click on there, you can ask Phyllis or myself. You can get on the listserv. There's calls every 2 weeks on Fridays at 10 a.m. You could dial into and get up to speed, not just on RGGI the AEPS, but basically clean power issues in Harrisburg. And just stay engaged and keep pushing, because there's no alternative, right? It's all we can do. So that's kind of my big picture perspective on that, Phyllis.
Well, thank you so much for your information and for your inspiration.
Sure.
Your 45 minutes were packed with so much stuff, and we thank your children for being patient. And
yes, they'll be good.
Especially thank you. So this was a fabulous presentation. Jackson put into the chat the link for the blog he was talking about, and it's got the slides in there and everything else. So it's really what you want to be using when you're making comments. So thank you all.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate the time and your guys' interest in all these issues. I know they're a little bit wonky, but it's all really important stuff. Like this is how we can get there. So just can't thank you all enough for your commitment and interest in all these issues, and look forward to following up and staying in touch.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
So now I want to introduce the woman whose name is the Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light. Her real name is Katie Ruth. She became the executive director of the Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light 3 months ago.
Almost 6 months ago now.
Oh, almost 6 months ago. Sorry about that.
It goes by so quickly, yeah?
Yeah, and she's going to talk to us about some other actions that we can be doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. So as Phyllis said, I am the executive director. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. I thought that presentation was fantastic. It's my second time hearing it, and I still learned some new things as I was taking it all in, particularly the graphs, and thinking about the extra progress we can make when we bundle these things together. I have a couple of action items that I want to share with you all tonight. before I kind of close this out with a short reflection. But before I do, I also just want to say the speaker suggested writing LTEs, letters to the editor. And for some of you, those are probably really common. They're part of your like regular practice. For others, maybe you've never written one before and you don't know what that looks like or how to get started. Or maybe you want to take a faith angle to an op-ed or an LTE and you're not sure how to get started, or you want some help thinking it through. That's something I'm always happy to offer, and any member of my team also as well. So if you want to raise your voice around this issue or other issues, you can always feel free to reach out to us as a resource to either help you get started or to look over something that you're getting ready to do. A tip that I learned recently is that if you're looking to get something published, paying attention to what religious holidays are going on. So if there's a specific religious holiday within your own tradition that's happening, writing from that perspective with a climate focus is much more likely to be published even in your local paper. So again, for some of you, this is like, you know this stuff already, but for some of you, you're kind of just getting started and figuring out maybe how to use your voice in a different way. So if that's you, you're more than welcome to reach out to me or any member of my team to help you think through some of that. We really would be glad to help support you in that work. So that's my little piece about LTEs. So tonight I have 3 further action items that are things that PA IPL is working on that I'd love to share with you. The first is something that probably, hopefully by this point, you've heard something about. So the EPA is currently reviewing its standards around soot pollution. And we are wanting to see those standards be as strong as possible to make our community safe and healthy. We are getting to the close of this open comment period at this point, and so you may have already signed on, but I'm going to drop a link into the chat if you would be interested in sharing your voice. You can either use the pre-filled language that's already available in that, or write your own and that will go directly over to the EPA to let them know that you're hoping to see those air pollution standards be as strong as possible. One of PA IPL's major focuses this year is really focused around air pollution. So we're really hoping to do some more work over the course of the year around this and some other rules that EPA is likely to announce for public comment this year. If you've already submitted public comment, which show of hands if you have, I hope that you have. Or if you're doing it right now, because I just dropped the link in the chat, that will also make my heart very happy. So if you have already done that, here's a few extra action items I can send your way. PA IPL is going to Region 3 EPA office on March 27th at noon. If you live near Philadelphia and you would like to join us, we're going to have a press conference with a couple of our environmental partners, and we are going to deliver a faith leader letter. So if you are a religious leader or you're connected with a religious leader of your particular community and you would like to invite them to sign onto our letter, or sign yourself if you are, I will put that link directly into the chat as well, so you can share that with them directly. But that's another way that you can further your impact by either telling a friend to sign on or by asking your faith leader to get involved, either on the day of March 27th or anytime beforehand by signing onto our faith leader comment letter. On that same vein, you can also collect comments from your faith community. So PA IPL put together our own toolkit that has a number of different resources. So like printouts that you can have during your congregation's worship time or coffee hour or whatever it is that you do, you can have that kind of just sitting out on the table so people can read about what's happening and then submit a comment either digitally, or there's an option for you to collect those literally old style on a piece of paper with a pen and then send those back into us and we can put them into the system for you. So if you're looking for ways to increase your impact beyond your individual voice, there's the link to the congregational toolkit also. Does anyone have any questions about the soot rolling or questions about the faith leader letter or the March 27th noon press conference? Cool. I'm going to move us right along. And of course, I'll drop my email in the chat before I leave tonight as well. So if you all have questions or would like to follow up, I'm available. The second thing that I wanted to share with you is something I'm very excited about. We are in the middle of receiving, well, we've closed orders now, but we have received about 25,000 requests for native trees this year through our partnership with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation across the state of Pennsylvania. I don't think we'll quite plant that many trees, but we're gonna do our very best to get as many of those out as possible. And so on March 31st at noon, we're hosting a webinar talking about the importance of native trees, some of the major effort that's underway to plant these trees this spring, and also an education session on how to plant and maintain native trees that you might plant. So if you have in the past or you're hoping to in the future, it's a great way to learn about this really great way that we can care for this planet that we share. We had a really fun thing happen earlier today where we actually ran out of registration room. We were not anticipating as many people registering for the program as have already. And so we had to up the space, get a bigger virtual room, which is really exciting. And so if you come and join us, you will be in very good company. So that is our program that's happening on March 31st at noon. And then beyond that, we talked a little bit about fossil fuel tonight and the fossil fuel industry. Some of you are probably very familiar with this and others may not be, but back in 2016, PA IPL actually passed a resolution as an organization that we are against all new fossil fuel infrastructure. And that has been our policy position for a long time now. And so if you've been following the news recently, you know that the current administration just approved a massive oil extraction project in Alaska. That has been very difficult. And like for folks who are activists like yourself and are kind of more deeply in this work, it can feel a little disheartening. And so PA IPL did release a statement about the Willow project and just expressing some of our disappointment and our concern with the project. And obviously we're paying very careful attention to the ongoing conversation, hoping to be involved in the ways that we can. And yeah, would welcome your support and input, both in sharing out with your friends and family, even just how you're feeling and the importance of decisions like this, and that the administration hears from folks that this is a significant choice and that it's one that's really disappointing. So if you didn't receive our email that has that statement, I'm also happy to send it your way. We will include it in the follow-up email that goes out for tonight's call. So those are the three big things that I wanted to share. Does anyone have any questions about any of those things that are happening? Or Phyllis, is there anything that I missed?
Well, I just want to put an explanation point on the last point about the Willow project. Every single one of us can be active on that individually. You can call the White House. I don't think it's open tomorrow. It's Tuesday through Thursday where they have hours where they accept calls. But you can always put a comment on their website. And the more people who comment, the more organizations that comment, the better it will be. Biden really reneged on a promise to all of us on this one. And we need to let him know that we're not happy. Although we're happy with a lot of other things he's done, this was a grave mistake. So this is something that you can easily do. If you take the statement that came out from IPL, if you take the statement that came out from Katie and just modify it a bit, you can put it right into their website.
Yeah, and certainly happy for you to copy, edit, use it in whatever ways that you can. I'll also drop a direct link to it in the chat for you all as well, in case you're not on our email list, which if you're not, if you don't get the notices for these calls and you don't get the follow-up emails, please let either Phyllis or I know, and we'd be glad to get you connected. I feel like every time I come on, there's like new faces in the room, and that's really exciting. So we're really glad that you're here.
Peg has a question, I believe, or a comment.
It's not a question, it's a comment on your suggestion, Phyllis. I really like that suggestion. Just go on the website and boom, say, Willow, this is disappointing, etc. Yeah.
Making it, either writing a letter to the editor or making a comment on a public comment period or writing to your president or your senator is not as tough as you think it is, because basically you're reading what other people have written and you're putting it in your own words. So, and it doesn't have to be long. It can be 2 or 3 sentences. but it's a really important action, as Jackson pointed out to us, that drum roll that we need to continuously do on all these issues. They're all important.
Yeah, and certainly as PA IPL continues and, in our partnership with JEA, really thinking through this and hearing different opportunities that become available, I'm sure you all will be some of the first to hear about different other ways that we might be able to advocate around this particular issue. It's certainly not over. This conversation is just taking on a new shape and a new form now. So.
Anybody else have a question or a comment? Okay.
I'm going to lead us into tonight's closing reflection, Phyllis, unless there's anything else you wanted to share. Great. Well, I want to reiterate my thanks to each of you for being on this call, and particularly want to be thankful for those of you who made a contribution to help support tonight's program. Your support really makes such a big difference in helping us do our work. It's sometimes easier to get grant funding for things like environmental education programs. It can be quite challenging to find dollars to, talk back to the powers that be, to tell them when we're not happy. And so we take your support very seriously and hope that you feel the same way. And so, yeah, very grateful to those of you who also either regularly contribute to our programs or chose to make a donation towards tonight's program. Just, want to be thankful for all the ways that people generously support with their time and resources and finances. So thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you all for coming and your participation, your questions, your enthusiasm was infectious, I believe.
So I have a closing piece of poetry to read. So you're getting a little window into some of my inner world. I love poetry. And actually the last 2 days, the PA IPL team and I were on retreat. We did a lot of wonderful work and thinking together. And I'm really excited to share some of the things that we did together here in the future. But I shared this poem with the team earlier today. And so I thought it would be a nice way to end our time together this evening as well, thinking about our place in the family of things. So this piece is called Wild Geese, and it's written by the poetry author, Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things.
Thank you all. This was a great session together, and we will meet again in April. So, thank you. Have a good evening.
Good night, everyone.
Enjoy spring.